Hey everybody, welcome to our second video lecture on persuasive strategies. In this video lecture, we'll look at some psychological principles of persuasion. These psychological principles of persuasion, they're techniques that you can use to motivate action by folks who are neither inclined nor obligated to act, that take advantage of some deep-seated features of human psychology. These psychological principles of persuasion were first identified and codified by this guy, Dr. Robert Cialdini, who's a professor at Arizona State University and the author of a number of really excellent books on the art and science of persuasion. I highly encourage you to go look into Cialdini's work. And Cialdini outlined 6 psychological principles of persuasion in these works, beginning with the principle of reciprocity. And reciprocity is simply the idea that you're more likely to persuade people if you've first given them something of value, or as that asterisk suggests, even if you've given them some junk, right? We don't know exactly why. It's just a deep-seated feature of the human psyche that when somebody gives you something, you feel compelled at some deep human level to give them something in return. And you can use this impulse to your advantage in your own persuasive writing. Imagine, for instance, that you work for a car dealership and you're trying to persuade your boss to adopt a new marketing strategy for that dealership, right? If you want to use reciprocity in your proposal, then give your audience something, give your boss, give your reader something in your proposal. That gift, as it were, it can take the form of some kind words or a compliment. But an even more powerful thing to provide is, for instance, some marketing deliverables, right? Some examples of how your marketing strategy would actually look in practice. And because this is work, this is a product of labor that you were not required to produce, many readers will perceive it, they'll read it as a gift, and will therefore feel at some level inclined to give you something in return, potentially even a yes to your proposal. Next, let's talk about the principle of consistency. Consistency is the idea that you're more likely to persuade people if your proposal builds on their prior commitments. For whatever reason, people don't like looking inconsistent. And so you can oftentimes persuade people to take a position if you can convince them that it builds upon a prior commitment, however small. So let's go back to the example of the car dealership. Imagine that your marketing proposal aligns with something that your boss has done in the past. Make sure you emphasize that prior behavior in your proposal, because you can then leverage the principle of consistency. You can basically say to your boss, hey, you did this thing in the past and it was okay, right? So now let's do it again in the present. That's how consistency can enhance your persuasive writing. Third, let's talk about the principle of consensus. And consensus is basically the idea that you're more likely to persuade people if they think your proposal is popular, right? Another way of identifying this principle is by calling it social proof. And it's basically just the idea that people tend to think something is a good idea if everybody else is doing it. So if you wanted to persuade your boss at the car dealership about your marketing strategy, one psychological appeal that you could make is simply saying, look, all the other car dealerships in town or in the area are using a similar approach. We should do the same. If it's good enough for all these other folks, it'll work out for us too. Next, let's talk about the principle of liking. Liking is the idea that you're more likely to persuade people if they like you, or even if they just think you like them. All right? Human beings like to be liked. It is sometimes an embarrassing feature of the human experience, but it is nevertheless a very real feature of the human experience. And so people are more likely to do things for folks that they like or who they think like them. And so if you're trying to persuade your boss to adopt your marketing strategy at the car dealership, you can use liking in a number of different ways. You can ideally develop a real friendship with your boss, such that they will, by the nature of that relationship, feel inclined to say yes to your proposal. If you can't or you haven't yet built that relationship with your supervisor, you can at very least, say nice things about your boss in the proposal. Talk about what an effective manager they've been, or what great things they've done for the car dealership. This is one of the reasons why we use goodwill so aggressively and so extensively in professional writing. It's because if your audience likes you, they're more likely to do what you want. That's the basic psychological principle of liking, and it's very, very powerful. Next, let's look at the principle of scarcity. And scarcity is the idea that you're more likely to persuade people if what you're proposing is unique or only briefly available. Let's go back to the car dealership. Hey, my proposal, we've got to act on this quickly, because if we don't, somebody might get this great idea. Or, hey, I'm one of only a handful of folks with experience in this area of marketing, and therefore my experience, my approach, my method is unique and valuable. Let's take advantage of that. That can be a powerful, persuasive appeal. Again, this is kind of similar to social proof. When something is scarce, that sends some signal to our lizard brain that says, hey, a lot of people like this. This must be great. This must be valuable. This must be important. And so we want to have that thing, whatever it is in our life, and it can motivate us to act when other forces may not. And then lastly, the final psychological principle of persuasion is authority. And authority is basically the idea that you're more likely to persuade people if they think you know what you're talking about. You don't even actually have to know what you're talking about. Your audience just has to think that you know what you're talking about, right? So going into that meeting with your boss with a marketing degree, having some credentials behind you, is going to make you more authoritative. You might not be any better at marketing than somebody who doesn't have a marketing degree, but you've got the weight of that degree behind you, which is going to make your message in some way more persuasive. Okay? So that brings us to the end of our examination of these 6 psychological principles of persuasion. You can most certainly use these psychological principles of persuasion in conjunction with the classical principles of persuasion. And if you haven't watched the other video lectures on persuasive appeals, on the classical principles of persuasion, and the real talk rules for persuasion, please make sure you do so as soon as possible. Finally, thanks, as always, for watching, everybody.